Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a mission that is, well, it's highly sensitive, it's deeply theological, and I think it's critically necessary for anyone on a conscious spiritual journey.
There really is.
Our deep dive is focused on one of the most powerful and, frankly, one of the least examined spiritual declarations out there. That definitive claim, God said.
It's the ultimate spiritual trump card, isn't it? I mean, it just stops conversation. It
Yes.
carries this immense weight, this authority, and it often demands, the immediate obedience. It shuts down critical thinking.
It does.
But the sources we've gathered for today, which really dig into that intersection of sincerity and spiritual declaration, they fundamentally challenge the idea that your conviction equals accuracy.
Exactly. And so our mission today is really to equip you, the listener, with a framework for that kind of critical awareness. We want to provide a way to distinguish between what is genuine, eternal, spiritual insight, what our source material carefully defines as the logos, or the breath, and what is often a heavily filtered echo.
Right. An echo of human history, personal conditioning, and just interpretation.
So the core question driving this entire conversation is this. When you hear that confident declaration, whether it's from a spiritual leader, a friend, or maybe even, in your own head, thus saith the Lord, how can we actually know?
How can we discern if that message really came from the eternal spirit, the Elohim Ruwach Breath, or if it's just the result of centuries of inherited thinking, cultural conditioning, or, well, frankly, fear?
And we absolutely have to start this entire deep dive with an immediate ringing call for caution. Should we be extremely cautious about casually saying God said? The answer from all of our material is a definitive, loud yes.
A resounding yes. And we should be clear, this isn't about judging the speaker's intent.
Yeah.
Sincerity is almost always present.
Oh, absolutely.
This is about guarding the integrity of the voice itself.
That caution is completely rooted in history. Our sources, they point out that throughout the ancient history of Israel, it was incredibly common for religious leaders, for kings, for prophets to confidently proclaim God said this or God said that.
And yet, history shows us what came out was often demonstrably not the voice of Elohim.
So this is where we need to establish our core terminology for this deep dive. When we talk about that authentic, eternal, pure voice, we're going to use three main terms. The first is the logos.
Which is defined here as the eternal, creative, spiritual activity. It's a movement.
Right. And second, the breath. Specifically, the Elohim Ruwach Breath, which references the eternal, moving spirit, the very life force. And the source is very specific about using the Hebrew Ruwach.
Yes, to emphasize movement, wind, life. It makes it really distinct from that more maybe rigid or static concept of the Holy Spirit that we see in later theological structures.
And finally, we have to introduce the antagonist in this story, the element that sort of acts as the great filter, the obfuscator of the logos.
The concealed word. And the concealed word is defined in our material as that historical inherited religious consciousness. You can think of it as this pervasive, invisible software that filters everything, and ultimately what it produces is separation.
A conditional relationship with the divine.
Yeah.
And that filter, that's what we'll constantly be testing messages against today. Does this align with the logos, with love, life, oneness? Or does it come from the concealed word, which is always, always charged with fear?
And that inherited consequence thinking.
Let's move into those historical echoes then, because this is not a new problem. This really sets the stage for why a discernment toolkit is so desperately needed.
It does. The history of organized faith is just, it's littered with declarations that were probably spoken with intense sincerity, but they were rooted in deep misinterpretations.
And even translation errors, right?
That's a huge distinction. The sources note this important observation about the lineage of error. So many declarations throughout history, especially those based on interpretations of sacred scripture, and the source specifically calls out the King James Version and others, they might be rooted in just plain false translations.
Or they were designed to enforce a specific, often fear-based theological structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a bit of academic jargon we need to unpack. The sources specifically call out the influence of penal substitutionary inclusions. Now, for you listening, this is a huge concept. Can you break down what that means?
I can. So penal substitutionary theology, in a nutshell, it argues that God's justice requires a payment for sin.
And that payment has to be violent.
Right. A substitutionary sacrifice, historically, Jesus dying in our place, to appease an angry, wrathful God. Our source material argues that this entire concept is an inclusion. It's a theological framework that was applied later to the texts.
So it wasn't originally there.
It's often rooted in specific mistranslations of Hebrew words, words related to judgment or consequence, sometimes confusing what is just natural cause and effect with some kind of punitive divine intervention.
Wow. So if the very foundation is flawed, if the text is being read through this lens of a demanding, punitive, wrathful deity because of these historical translation errors,
Then everything built on top of it, anything declared as God said, just inherits that fundamental flaw.
and that leads to this profound confusion. When sincerely spoken words, words charged with this inherited consequence thinking, are mistaken for the pure voice of the Father, the damage is, well, it's twofold.
Okay, what are they?
First, fear is empowered, because the voice now demands and threatens and judges. And second, the genuine beauty of the Logos word, that eternal creative movement of life. It becomes hopelessly entangled in the noise of those earthly interpretations.
And the source is careful here. It's not about shaming history.
Not at all. It's a gentle, necessary correction for the collective body, the ecclesia, which has for so long been conditioned to mistake its own internal anxiety for divine instruction.
Okay, let's make this abstract idea really concrete. The source material gives us some specific examples of commands supposedly given by God that the breath, based on its fixed eternal nature of life, would just not command.
And these examples are used to illustrate this fabrication of an angry or contradictory or just unstable God that's operating through human filters.
Let's start with the first one, which directly challenges our concepts of purity, life, and union. The source asks this question. If breath is the source of all life, how can it be that God would tell Abraham or the ancient leaders to put women out by themselves during their menstrual cycle and declare them unclean?
And the source immediately asserts, breath would not say that. That is a powerful, profound challenge.
It is. If the Logos is the eternal law of abundant life and wholeness, why would a natural, life-giving, biological, generative process, a process tied completely to the continuation of our species, be declared unclean or shameful or isolating by the very source of life itself?
It creates a theological paradox, doesn't it? If the breath is the voice of life and union, then any command that enforces physical separation or mandates a moral judgment or declares a sacred being unclean because of a natural cyclical process must, by definition, come from a consciousness filtered through separation and fear and superstition.
The very lenses of the concealed word.
It's the human filter imposing fear of the feminine or fear of natural cycles and then attributing that fear to the divine.
I think some listeners might push back on that, though. They might argue that these commands were just for historical reasons, sanitary or cultural purposes, and that we're judging ancient texts with a modern moral lens.
That is the perfect question to ask.
So where does the source draw that line between historical context and eternal truth?
The line is drawn at the Logos standard. The Logos is eternal. It's unchanging and it is fixed in life. So if a command, regardless of the historical context, contradicts the nature of life, love, and oneness, if it permanently enforces shame or separation, then it cannot originate from the breath.
Well, it might be a cultural law.
Or a tradition that was given divine sanction,
Yeah.
but it is not the Logos.
That brings us to the second example, which is just as provocative and deeply physical. The source challenges the command that all men be circumcised when the part that is cut off is the most erogenous zone in the male body.
And again, the assertion is so direct, breath would not do that. The source connects this to the idea that there are potentially thousands of commands in the Bible, supposedly given by God, that contradict the true nature of the breath.
So this isn't a small issue.
No, it's a systemic challenge to a religious authority that has prioritized conformity and, visible marking over an inherent internal wholeness.
Let's unpack that connection a bit more. If the Logos is the principle of wholeness and union and abundant life, then a command that mandates the physical removal of a part of the sacred being.
Especially one designed for pleasure and life continuation.
Right. That would seem to contradict the Logos principle of intrinsic wholeness.
It does. The source sees this as part of an overall pattern where human awareness, which is fearful of the body, fearful of sexuality, and focused on control, projected its own desires for physical conformity onto the divine.
So human awareness says, if you want to be holy, you must be cut.
Exactly. But the Logos, conversely, says, you are holy, whole, and complete exactly as you are.
So if we synthesize these two examples, the menstrual cycle separation and the mandated circumcision, the analysis is clear. They're being used as potent evidence.
Yes. If the breath speaks only of life, wholeness, and union, then commands that promote physical separation, bodily shame or the removal of a natural function, they likely originate from that human filtered consciousness.
Not from the true nature of the logos.
Absolutely. The conclusion, according to our material, is inescapable. These examples force us to a much deeper level of discernment. If ancient leaders and modern interpreters who follow those ancient texts have mistaken their own filtered awareness for the voice of Elohim,
Then we have to establish a clear, non-negotiable standard for what the true voice actually sounds like.
and that moves us away from these historical conditional commands and toward eternal, non-negotiable principles.
We've seen the historical consequence of poor discernment. This brings us right to the core mechanism of the error, the filter itself. Section 2 is all about that vast space between hearing an inner voice, which is universal, and that voice being the pure logos, which is rare without conscious work.
And this is where the analysis gets deeply psychological and spiritual. The source establishes a baseline. Every single person hears an inner voice.
It's a constant dialogue, right? Self-talk, intuition, conscience.
It's a fundamental, universal human experience, and that in and of itself is not the problem. The constant presence of an inner dialogue is just a given of being conscious.
Okay, so if the inner voice isn't the problem, what is the precise issue here?
The problem is what awareness is doing in the hearing. The inner voice is always colored by the state of a person's awareness. If that awareness is unexamined, unrenewed, historically conditioned,
Then the message will reflect the condition of the receiver, not the purity of the sender.
exactly, the message came from the part of their awareness still interpenetrated by the concealed word.
Okay, so let's dedicate some serious time to unpacking the mechanics of the concealed word. We defined it as the religious consciousness that produces separation, but how does it operate, day to day to filter our internal experience?
The source specifies that the concealed word operates through 5 primary lenses. You can think of them as this historical, fearful software running in the background of our minds, shaping every single interpretation.
And what are those 5 components?
They are separation, fear, reward, punishment, and superstition.
Let's try and illustrate this for the listener. How does the lens of separation color the inner voice?
Separation makes the inner voice sound conditional. So instead of, "you are loved," the message becomes, "you will be loved once you fix X, Y, and Z."
Ah, so it creates a dichotomy, holy versus unholy, inside versus outside, saved versus unsaved.
Precisely. It makes the divine seem distant, requiring a priest or a doctrine or a sacrifice to bridge a gap that the logo says doesn't even exist in the first place.
And what about the lens of fear, reward, and punishment? That seems to be what generates the anxiety we so often mistake for conviction, isn't it?
Absolutely. If the inner voice is passed through that fear, reward, punishment lens, it will inevitably sound like a transactional deity. The inner voice says, if I do this good thing, God will reward me with success. That's the reward lens.
Or, and this is maybe more pernicious, if I fail at this task, God will punish me with consequences. That's the punishment lens.
And this creates a spiritual life that's driven by anxiety about performance rather than an acceptance of abundant life.
That anxious performance loop is what the source calls unexamined awareness. It's colored by inherited consequences thinking. So this is an awareness we've inherited from centuries of religious conditioning.
It's that thick veil that causes our inner conversation to be instantly and mistakenly perceived as the pure voice of the Logos.
So it's the difference between hearing, a crystal clear, full spectrum sound of the breath.
And hearing it played through a static-filled, fear-based filter. The source suggests that this inherited consequence thinking feels intensely spiritual because we are conditioned to believe that deep emotion equals spiritual depth.
Right. When we feel fear about a consequence, we believe that fear must be divinely mandated because that's what tradition has taught us for generations.
Can we get specific here? How does this inherited consequence thinking manifest in the everyday spiritual life of someone listening?
Good idea. Let's think about common spiritual anxieties. A person gets a flat tire on the way to a charity event. Unexamined awareness, filtered through this consequence thinking, immediately whispers,
You must have done something wrong yesterday. This flat tire is God's punishment for missing your quiet time.
exactly. That feeling of sudden, overwhelming guilt feels like a spiritual message, but it's just the concealed word applying the punishment lens to a random circumstance.
The pure logos wouldn't assign a moral value to a defective radial tire.
No. And what's fascinating is the way earthly awareness defends itself and masks its true origin. The source highlights this by saying earthly awareness is skilled at imitation. It knows exactly how to mimic genuine inspiration to give its own voice divine authority.
And this imitation is highly effective because it uses spiritual disguises. Let's detail these, because they are central to discerning the voice in real time. First, awareness can wrap fear in spiritual language and call it direction.
So, for example, instead of acknowledging a personal, internal anxiety about taking a career risk, the message becomes, God told me definitively not to apply for that job because the city it's in is corrupt.
The speaker is framing their personal anxiety as divine foresight, giving their fear spiritual authority. It's a very clever disguise.
Okay, what's the second disguise?
It can cloak insecurity in divine authority and call it obedience. So when a person is grappling with deep uncertainty or a lack of self-trust, the voice demands rigid adherence to external rules or a specific rigid structure.
And the speaker validates their insecurity about navigating life by claiming that following some harsh, restrictive external path is divinely mandated obedience.
Right. And third, it can echo old traditions and call it revelation. So it's not a true unveiling of the Logos, but it's just a regurgitation of historically conditioned beliefs about hell or end times or moral rigidity.
And that message feels incredibly safe and spiritual because it aligns perfectly with the listener's childhood Sunday school lessons, even if that traditional teaching completely contradicts the core nature of life.
And the consequence of this powerful imitation is profound. Because this disguised voice is charged with consequence thinking, it feels intensely emotional and therefore trustworthy. When someone shares their revelation, their conviction is genuine.
They really believe they heard God.
But the material is explicit. Convincing emotion does not equal Logos truth. The purity of the breath is lost in all this historical noise.
The tragedy, then, is that the listener is navigating a spiritual landscape where their inner voice is constantly being contaminated by these filters of separation and punishment. It makes it nearly impossible to access the true Logos without specific tools for deconditioning this unexamined awareness.
We have to learn to recognize the sound of the fear filter before we can hear the sound of life.
We've defined the problem, that insidious filter of the concealed word, so now we can pivot to the solution. Establishing the non-negotiable nature of the true voice, the Logos, and the breath.
Right. If we can articulate what the true voice is, we can instantly identify what it is not.
This section provides that fixed definition. The Logos is defined not as a historical event or a book, but as the creative spiritual activity and movement within that reveals the eternal law of abundant life.
And this is key, which is already present in every sacred being. It is an active principle, not a static command.
That framing is so essential. The Logos isn't something external that we have to earn or find somewhere else. It is an active, present reality revealing the law of abundant life that is already within us, inherent to our nature.
And the source describes these consistent qualities of the Logos that make it instantly recognizable, regardless of culture or tradition. First, it is not concealed, and it is not contradictory.
So if a message is confusing, or it requires some kind of esoteric knowledge, or it seems to reverse a previous divine instruction without cause,
It cannot be the Logos. The breath does not traffic in confusion.
its function is consistent. The Logos always invites, illumines, and lifts. It brings light, expansion, and elevation, never demand, condemnation, or a requirement for diminishment.
And crucially, it always aligns with awakened awareness. The more conscious and deconditioned we become, the clearer and simpler the Logos is heard.
And fundamentally, the Logos always reveals oneness.
Always. It reflects love, life, wholeness, and union, and it leads to that definitive state the source calls eternal I exist awareness. It affirms identity and unconditional existence. I am, therefore I am eternally accepted.
It never challenges or conditionalizes our existence based on performance or status.
Let's elaborate on that I exist awareness. It seems to be the exact opposite of the separation that the concealed word promotes.
It is. The concealed word tells us you are a sinner, you fell, you are separate, you must strive to return.
But the Logos, revealing oneness, declares you are already here. You are the expression of life. I exist is your eternal reality. Any voice that minimizes or shrinks or conditionalizes that existence is, by definition, operating from the fear and separation lens.
I really appreciate the analogy the source uses here, comparing the breath, the Elohim Ruwach Breath, to the sun. The sun cannot deny its own light.
Right, you can't suddenly decide to produce darkness or coldness while still remaining the sun.
Its nature is fixed.
Therefore, the breath can only speak one voice, the voice of life. Anything that introduces death or threat or separation or instability is a deviation. It's a misinterpretation or a fabrication rooted in human fear.
And because the breath is fixed in this eternal nature of life and oneness, we can now generate a definitive list of messages that, by theological necessity, cannot arise from the breath.
This is the sharp, critical point of the entire deep dive. When we hear these things declared, we can be certain they arise from the realm of the concealed word, because the Logos cannot deny its own nature.
Let's go through this list in detail, making sure we understand why each of these common spiritual statements fails the Logos test. First one, God told me this tragedy or end times destruction is coming.
This fails because the Logos reveals abundant life, not threats. A voice speaking of tragedy and doom relies on the fear lens of the concealed word to drive compliance or attention.
The breath, like the sun, shines light and warmth. It doesn't whisper predictions of impending shadow and global destruction.
Exactly. Number two, God said he is angry with you, or God is disappointed in our nation.
This is a direct contradiction of the eternal nature of love and oneness. Anger implies instability, moodiness, and conditional acceptance.
If the breath operates from a mood, then its foundation is just shifting sand. The source defines the true voice as one that doesn't operate from instability or emotional reactivity. That's a human projection of a reactive parent onto the divine.
Okay, third and fourth, which are intensely common messages. God said you missed his will, or God said you were out of order.
These rely so heavily on separation, fear, and punishment thinking. The true Logos is about affirming that I exist identity and wholeness, confirming that where you are, life is present.
So messages about missing some cosmic checklist or being out of order create immense spiritual anxiety. They imply that life is this narrow, dangerous path that requires external correction.
Instead, an expansive, self-aware journey.
Right.
Number five, God said he is punishing America or any specific nation, group, or person, usually through a natural disaster or political upheaval. This invokes the punishment and consequence thinking filter. It frames the divine as a reactive, punitive entity responsible for the suffering of nations.
And this contradicts the Logos, which states that life is lawful and abundant, and that suffering often results from humanity's failure to align with the laws of oneness, not from some punitive remote deity.
Okay, number six, and this ties directly back to our discussion of historical inclusions. God said Jesus had to die for you.
This is the centerpiece of the contradiction. If the Logos is life, love, and oneness, it fundamentally cannot mandate penal substitution, a violent conditional payment to satisfy its own requirement for justice.
The Logos revealed that reconciliation is an unveiling of an already present union, not a transaction mediated by blood sacrifice. Any voice asserting a violent necessity for salvation is speaking the language of the concealed word.
Not the pure Logos.
Never. Okay, number seven. God said mankind fell from him in the beginning.
Again, the Logos reveals oneness. So a message reinforcing a foundational historical separation, a catastrophic fall from grace that severed our intrinsic connection, is inherently derived from the consciousness of separation.
From the concealed word. The breath affirms the eternal presence of the sacred being. It doesn't begin its message with the premise of a fundamental absence or deficiency.
And finally, the eighth one. God said all people are sinners, or you are fundamentally broken.
This relates right back to the separation component of the concealed word. If you start with the premise of brokenness or deficiency, you necessitate an external repair.
But the Logos, which reveals the eternal law of abundant life present in every sacred being, affirms that I exist identity. It doesn't condemn our fundamental human nature.
The true voice affirms wholeness, even when we are acting from unawakened awareness.
So the synthesis here becomes the ultimate filter. Any message that speaks of penal substitution, any threat, doom, punishment, end times destruction, or implies an unstable or moody Elohim.
It must arise from the concealed word, because the breath cannot deny its own fixed nature of life, love, and oneness. The emotional charge of the message is completely irrelevant.
If the content contradicts the nature of love, it's filtered.
If the Logos is the only fixed standard, how do we actually tune in? Section 4 shifts our attention to the act of hearing, the awakened hearing process. It moves us from merely defining the voice to actively perceiving it.
Right, and the source provides a very specific definition of what it actually means to hear Elohim Ruwach Breath. It is defined as perceiving from awakened awareness.
This requires us to stop listening through the fear filter and start listening through a unified perception.
So what are the practical steps to facilitate that state?
Well, first, it means listening through the single eye, a concept that references unified, clear perception. It's often interpreted as the state where intellectual and emotional awareness are aligned.
Or where the mind isn't divided by fear and doubt.
Exactly. It's about focusing your intention without that internal conflict.
So it's not just intellectual agreement, it's a holistic, undivided attention.
It is. And second, it means actively releasing the chatter and posturing of earthly religious opinion. That old inherited noise, the static of consequence thinking. It must be consciously set aside.
We have to quiet the history of dogma long enough to hear the eternal principle.
And the ultimate goal is to allow that inner logos activity to rise unhindered. When we achieve this state of awakened awareness, the message that surfaces comes with guarantees. It's not a matter of trusting some fleeting emotion.
It's about recognizing inherent, fixed qualities.
Right. When breath truly speaks, the message is guaranteed to carry certain qualities. These act as an internal confirmation for you, a spiritual fingerprint of the logos.
Let's list these key components that confirm integrity. First, it must reflect oneness with Elohim. It confirms union, not separation.
Second, it must align with the eternal nature of love. If it demands cruelty or judgment, it fails.
Third, it must reveal life, not threats. It should encourage the continuation and abundance of being.
Fourth, it must expand conscious awareness. The message should make your worldview bigger, more inclusive, more compassionate.
It should never shrink your circle or make you feel exclusive.
Never. Fifth, it must actively dismantle fear. If the message requires fear for compliance or adherence, it is not the breath. Fear is the signature of the concealed word.
Sixth, it must lift the listener into I exist identity, confirming their inherent unconditional sacredness.
And finally, it must mirror the life Jesus modeled as the consecrated messenger, meaning it aligns with an embodiment of love, radical inclusion, wholeness, and life over law.
The source reinforces the non-negotiable principle derived from these qualities. Breath never speaks in contradiction. Breath never speaks in confusion. Breath never has two voices.
Therefore, any message that fractures unity is not breath. This becomes the ultimate unbreakable litmus test.
This systematic approach leads us directly to the critical filter, the 5 questions the source presents as essential for both the awakened teacher and the discerning learner. These are the tools we must apply before we confidently declare, God said.
And these questions, they force the message out of the realm of subjective emotion and into the realm of integrity and logos alignment. They are meant to be a conscious, slow check.
Let's walk through them. Question 1. Does this align with the true logos life revealed in Jesus? This question grounds the message in that established, embodied pattern of the eternal law of abundant life.
Is the message consistent with the one who healed, who included, who spoke non-condemnation?
Question 2. Does this bring peace to heart awareness or agitation? This is an internal check on emotional resonance. Peace indicates alignment with oneness.
Whereas agitation often points to the fear, the striving, the separation that's inherent in the consequence thinking of the concealed word.
Question 3. Does this produce life or fear? This is the fundamental, non-negotiable test of the voice's nature. If the instruction, when you follow it, results in feeling more alive, more connected, more whole, it passes.
If it results in anxiety or guilt or striving, it fails. Simple as that.
Question 4. Does this expand consciousness or shrink it? Does the message make you feel more exclusive, more judgmental of others, more rigid in your rules? That's shrinking.
Or does it make you feel more empathetic, universally connected, and open to possibilities? That's expanding awareness.
And the final self-reflective question, which requires some deep honesty. Question 5. Does this arise from my oneness or from old awareness fears of separation?
This one forces the speaker to look beneath all the spiritual language and identify the root source of their motivation. Was it fear of consequence or punishment? Or was it the affirmation of eternal I exist identity?
And if a message, no matter how loud or convincing it feels, fails even one of these 5 questions, the source is clear. It is not breath.
And the material emphasizes that this failure isn't some spiritual defeat. It's simply evidence of an awareness still unlearning centuries of religious conditioning. The process is one of purification and deconditioning. It's not about judgment.
This detailed process of listening brings us back to that fascinating linguistic point the source highlights about the very meaning of obedience in Scripture.
Yes, the source notes that the word often translated as obey in Scripture, it comes from a Hebrew root that literally means listen attentively.
Yeah.
It's an auditory discipline, first and foremost.
And the source adds the necessary imperative to complete the meaning. Then repeat exactly what was said, not what you think was said.
That addition is transformative. It implies that true spiritual obedience is not blind compliance to an external fearful command, but it's the internal discipline to listen so attentively through that single eye that your personal filter is minimized.
It means ensuring the message you repeat is an accurate, purified reflection of the Logos, and not a translation warped by our own fears or religious traditions.
And that internal discipline is the very heart of awakened hearing.
We've established the filter for the individual listener. Now let's look at the collective impact. Section 5 turns to the critical responsibility of leadership ministers, teachers, guides, because their declarations of God said have an exponential reach.
The source emphasizes that words shape worlds. They have immense generative power. A leader's words either awaken the inherent logos in the listener or they numb it. They are either free and expansive or bound by tradition and fear.
So when a leader confidently speaks, they are, whether they mean to or not, laying the groundwork for the listener's entire spiritual reality.
And the greatest danger here, which the source identifies as incredibly pervasive, is the private hotline assumption. When a minister or leader claims they have a direct, private, exclusive line to Elohim, implying they are a necessary intermediary.
People naturally grant them authority.
And this is where the dynamic becomes dangerous. The material observes that listeners often, and without even realizing it, trust the minister's external voice more than they trust their own inner logos.
They outsource their spiritual authority. They stop listening through their own single eye and start listening through the leader's filtered awareness.
This creates a cycle of dependency. It externalizes authority away from the eternal I exist reality within. And when that externalized authority declares, God said, but the message reinforces the filters: fear, exclusivity, religious bondage, penal substitution doctrine, separation. The consequence is catastrophic for the listener's inner life.
That leader, even if they have the most sincere intentions,
Places a veil between the listener and their pure inner voice. They are perpetuating the concealment of the logos by reinforcing the concealed word. They force the listener to filter their own experience, their own inner dialogue, through the leader's conditioned, fearful, consequence-based awareness.
the listener learns to prioritize the voice of separation over the voice of life.
And this fundamentally redefines the teacher's primary function. It is not to speak for Elohim as though Elohim is some distant figure who requires a spokesperson.
So what is the teacher's true calling, according to the source?
It's radically different. It is to awaken people to hear breath for themselves. The goal is empowerment and self-authority, not dependency.
We see this modeled so beautifully in the examples of Jesus and the consecrated messengers. They consistently point people inward toward the same breath voice that speaks within them.
They never say, I am the only one who can hear. They say, the kingdom is within. Listen to the spirit within you. They empower the listener's own inherent connection to the logos.
This shift in mandate requires a commensurate shift in language, a movement from confident assertion toward intellectual and spiritual integrity.
If we're aiming for accuracy, we have to adopt language that honors the breath, that honors the listener's sovereignty, and that honors oneness. It prevents us from placing divine, fixed authority on words that did not actually originate from the logos.
So this is the practical application of this whole deep dive, using accurate language. And the source provides some powerful, precise alternatives to casually declaring, God said.
Instead of declaring, one can choose language that acknowledges the personal process of perception. For example, what rose in my awareness is.
That acknowledges that the message was filtered through my current state of consciousness. It invites a listener to apply the 5-question filter to it rather than just accepting it as a divine decree.
Right. Or moving slightly closer to the source but still acknowledging perception. What I sense from breath is this maintains the connection to the divine source while clearly implying a perception that is subject to internal testing and ongoing refinement.
Or even more grounded in the definition of the true voice and the goal of awakened awareness. What aligns with the logos in me is this is stating a principle, an eternal truth, not a personal instruction.
And finally, encompassing the entire process we've talked about today, what I perceive from awakened awareness is.
These phrases are so much more than just conversational fillers. They enforce a profound accountability and integrity on the speaker.
They honor the breath by not misrepresenting its fixed, non-contradictory nature. They honor you, the listener, by not demanding blind, fearful trust. And they celebrate our oneness by placing the authority back into the principle of the Logos Life-Love union.
Rather than resting it solely on the personality or emotion of the speaker. The goal, ultimately, is not policing speech, but awakening to the sacredness of the breath voice within.
If we speak as though Elohim Ruwach Breath said something, we must be absolutely certain that those words came from the Logos, the principle of life, and not merely from the deeply embedded yet false echoes of old, fearful, separated awareness.
This has been a monumental deep dive into some really complex spiritual territory. Our entire journey today was about discerning the voice, that necessary transition away from casual, unfiltered spiritual declarations toward precise, tested, and awakened awareness.
We could comprehensively cover the filters of the concealed word separation, fear, reward, punishment, and superstition. And we established the non-negotiable fixed nature of the Logos, which always speaks life, love, and oneness.
We provided the tools, especially those 5 critical questions, to test any message for its integrity against the standard of eternal life.
The invitation here is for the collective ecclesia, and really for every single person listening in, into a higher conversation, a clearer voice, and a purer Logos understanding. This requires deep inner listening, attentive discipline, and a willingness to diligently decondition centuries of inherited thought and fear.
And we can end on the encouraging and, I think, fundamentally challenging conclusion provided by our source material. Breath never stopped speaking. We had only been listening through veiled awareness. Now we listen through awakened awareness, and what we hear is life.
Now, for your final provocative thought. If you were to apply the 5-question discernment filter, does it align with the Logos? Peace or agitation? Life or fear? Expand or shrink? Oneness or separation? To the last 3 divine directions or prophetic words you received or heard, how many would pass the test of aligning with life, oneness, and the dismantling of fear?
That is the exploration that starts now.